Hello. Thank you for coming onto the webinar. We're going to get to some source code shortly, this being a webinar aimed at developers. But before we do, I want to set a little bit of context for the webinar and talk about what LDC Via is. So in brief, LDC Via is a platform to give a great new home to data and applications that for whatever reason are not any longer going to live on Domino. My name's Julian Woodward. I'm one of the 4 founders of LDC Via, the other 3 being Matt White, Ben Poole and Mark Myers, all of whom you will hear from during the course of this webinar. If you've attended conferences like IBM Connect and Engage and Icon UK and a few others, you may well have met us or seen us around or seen one of us presenting. Please do ask questions in the chat box as we're going along. We'll try to answer them either at the time or at the end of the webinar, or if they're really good questions, both. So why LDC Via? As I've said, LDC Via is a platform to provide a great new home for data and applications that are moving off Domino. So where an organization has migrated email or is planning to migrate email off Domino onto typically Office 365 or Google, they're normally then going to be left with a load of data and applications that live in Notes and Domino. Often the number of those applications will come as a bit of a surprise to the organization in question. If Domino's been used for a long time, they won't necessarily be aware of how extensive the portfolio of applications is. So we can talk another time probably about how to identify which applications are active, which can be mothballed, which can simply be deleted, etc. But the important thing to recognize is that there will be a lot of data that needs to be retained, and a significant number of applications where there needs to be a path forward. So they either need to be migrated or rebuilt or modernized in some way. If you don't do that, you have to take a decision to either throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes, and lose the data and the applications. And for the business, that could be quite a significant backward step. Or you stay on Notes and Domino, but that can be costly both in terms of licensing and running costs. So the alternative is by using LDC Via as a new home for Domino data, you get access to mechanisms to really easily migrate data away from Domino. And in turn, that easy migration means that the migration project is going to run faster because it's easy. Perhaps the migration project won't cost as much because with LDC Via there's no need to massage and clean and restructure the data. Or the migration may be of a higher quality because LDC Via takes the data as it is, again without this need to restructure and mess around with it and interfere with it. If the data goes into Domino, it will go into LDC Via with no significant change. And because of that, the business risk involved in the migration is also lower because of this direct and easy nature of the way the data is being transferred. And once you're migrated, you'll end up with a better fit. The new or reworked application then doesn't need to be developed by specialists using IBM's dedicated tooling, Domino Designer. It can be developed using whatever tools, application frameworks and languages the business uses for all its other development. So those are some of the aspects that we believe make LDC Via uniquely compelling for organizations moving away from Notes and Domino. But if you're in an organization that's not moving away from Notes and Domino, we can still help. Domino is a venerable and very impressive piece of technology. which is a great strength, but its age also brings some weaknesses. And two of those weaknesses are in the areas of performance and scalability. Domino starts complaining when the size of a database reaches really more than a few gigabytes, or when the complexity of an application increases perhaps over time, and there are lots of views and ad hoc queries and interrogation reporting tasks going on. Now, it's possible to argue that an application on Domino shouldn't be built with lots of views and lots of ad hoc queries and things, but that's turning things on their head, really, because that's forcing the limitations of the platform, or rather using the limitations of the platform to force developers and potentially end users to make compromises in what they're doing. And that can result in either in lost features or missing features, or overly complex code that then has a hidden future cost in terms of maintenance. LDC Via, by contrast with that, is built on a modern database foundation, and while it has all the flexibility of Domino in terms of the document-centric NoSQL storage model, it's really in a different league when it comes to performance and scalability. So if you are staying on Domino, have a think about this. What if you could rip all the reporting and analysis out of Domino applications, and instead put them onto an LDC Via synchronized copy, a replica, if you like, of the Domino data? That will take load off the Domino server. It takes complexity out of the applications, especially views. It's going to help Domino performance. It's going to reduce backup costs because view indexes take up space, which is going to reduce backup time windows and potentially also keep a lid on maintenance costs. So there's a good reason for an organization that is staying on Domino to still think about how to use LDC Via to improve the benefit they get from their technology. A third big area would be selectively moving data off Domino, and a great example here is mail archive databases. So these tend to take up a lot of space on Domino servers and therefore a lot of space on backups. Worse still, if an organization migrates email system, these mail archives may be left behind and not migrated with the live email. And that means that users and potentially the business might lose access to important historical business records, which emails are. So moving those into LDC Via takes them off the Domino infrastructure, takes them out of the backup consideration, but makes them accessible and easily searchable. And we have some really good features specifically for email archives that we can talk about separately. But it's not just about email. Using LDC Via as a repository for selectively stripping data out of Domino production applications is another very viable and potentially valuable option from the business's point of view. So I've talked a lot about why LDC Via is wonderful, as we believe it is. Let's talk about what it actually is. So as I said, it's been built to give a great answer to the question of what to do next with Domino or after Domino. The core of LDC Via splits into three main areas, as you will see. There's a set of tools to move data between Domino and LDC Via. They move that data to the data platform, which is a Domino-like data platform. And that's, I say Domino-like because it's been specifically created to reproduce the best bits of Domino and some of the most eccentric bits of Domino. So readers and authors fields at the document level, rich text, file attachments, response hierarchies, doc links, and full text searching, which are all fantastic Domino features that don't necessarily exist elsewhere. But when we've taken all these great features and reproduced them, we've left behind some of the less good bits of Domino, the lovely 32K limits that we all enjoy, and the gigabyte restrictions on total database size, and some of the performance considerations I've already touched on. And the third big part of LDC Via is what's called on the slide development support. So it's a set of APIs, and these are modern REST-based, open, if you like, APIs that let developers get to work. And that's where we'll spend most of the time on this webinar, looking at these APIs. So looking at the data migration aspect, there are two ways to do this. If you have internet-facing Domino servers, and you can enable Domino data services on those, then you can migrate the data using a web-based online tool. That's very simple. It's not necessarily something you would use to migrate an entire organization's data, but it's a good place to start. The other option is to use the desktop tool. That's much more configurable and scriptable because it's command line driven. Now we realize not everyone's entirely overjoyed at the prospect of using command line tools, so we will soon release a version of that has a notes database wrapper around it that will make it feel much more familiar, but without losing any of the power of the command line version. You just lose the requirement to go into command line prompts and edit XML files and such fun things. So using this desktop tool, the second one, you can do a one-off migration, but you can also do a continuous update from Domino to LDC Via. So that's a sort of trickle update. Or, and this is a coming soon feature at this point, do bidirectional synchronization between Domino and LDC Via and back again. So that's replication is the word for that in the Domino world, right? The most important thing to note about the migration, whichever mechanism you use, is that Via will take the Domino data without you having to waste time and effort cleaning, restructuring, and normalizing it. It's a straight transition from one to the other. Very, very easy. If you've not already seen the previous webinar where we talked more about these aspects and some of the other non-developer features of LDC Via, you might want to take a look. The link is on your screen now. If you don't have a photographic memory, the easier way is to go to our website where the webinar is linked from there, the recording, or it's just on YouTube and you can go and find it. Just search for LDC Via. So I've migrated my data. Now what? At this stage, you've taken your data, you've moved it. You have three options. We have some pre-built templates. So things like document libraries, discussions, team rooms will work, completely work. So you can take a discussion, move it from Domino to LDC Via, and in moments, carry on using it, carry on posting new topics, responding to things, fully functional applications straight off the bat. We also have a read-only mail archive or mail file viewer. The reason that's read-only is because we're not providing a mail system, but it does have some nice features like the ability to export a migrated email as a .eml file, so you can bring it back to life in whatever email system you're using. So that's the first option. The second option is to use our LDC Via Lens feature. It's not a separate product, it's a feature to configure a simple application using sort of point and click and drag and drop type tooling. So there's no coding required at that point. There's also no coding possible, or very limited coding possible at that point. So it's great for simple applications. It's great for putting a familiar navigation mechanism in a sort of forms and views way over migrated data that users will be happy with to explore and discover data. You can also develop interactive read-write applications with that. But the third mechanism, the third thing you can do with your data is really why we're here, which is to build your own application using the API. And the question then is, what development platform? This is an easy one. It's whatever you want. As I said before, the LDC Via APIs are all REST-based. They're very modern style of API. Developers on whatever platform are going to be really quite comfortable once they understand the concepts of LDC Via, which are similar to the concepts of Domino, the document-centric nature of the structure of the data. Developers are not going to have a hard time understanding how to use the APIs. So we're going to look at three sample applications today. We could have written samples in Python or .NET or even in XPages, but we've chosen to do React, which is a client-side JavaScript library, node.js, which is a server-side JavaScript framework, and Vaadin with Java, which is an increasingly popular Java framework. So at this point, I'll hand over to Matt and we'll get stuck into the real meat of this, which is the source code.
Thanks, Julian. So what the three of us are going to do for the rest of this session is basically go through building an application using those three different languages or platforms that Julian mentioned earlier. And we're all going to be working against the same LDC Via database on the back end. So what we have is a very simple person directory application, and we're just going to be showing first name and last name type data from a database that contains about 200,000 records. So it's not a small database, but it is real, and it's something that we can work with and play around with and sort of test our different programming structures that we want to use in this session. So I'm going to talk about using React, which is a JavaScript library developed by Facebook and made open source, which is of the new model of application frameworks that control the entire output of HTML into a browser window. The nice thing about React is that it doesn't do everything for you. So it doesn't do network interaction. So we're also going to be making use of jQuery in this demo. And there are two things in a React application. You have an HTML file and JavaScript. The HTML is actually the simplest bit of all. It really is just a placeholder. So initially you need to download the React JavaScript, any other JavaScript that you need to use, like jQuery, and any CSS files that you need to use in your application. So in this demo, we're going to be using Bootstrap to lay out the page. But other than that, the actual markup of the application in the HTML file is very, very minor. You have a simple container and a div that you then insert content into as the page gets built by React. So at its simplest, when we create an object in React, it's going to output some HTML that will get inserted into the container div on the original HTML page. And you can have one or you can have 1,000 of these different objects, and they will render in different ways depending on the configuration of your JavaScript code. So at the very, very simplest, you could have a simple div that displays the words hello and then the name of a property that you send into the div. So in this screenshot here on the right-hand side, we've got a div that says hello, John, because that's the configuration that we're going to render at runtime. We're obviously going to do something a little more complex than that. With every operation in LDC Via, you need to be authenticated. And we've got two ways of operating. Mark's going to show you one way and I'm going to show you one way. The first way that makes most sense with jQuery operations and client-side JavaScript operations is to go and get a session cookie from the LDC Via server. So that is, we pass a username and password to LDC Via. The server says, yep, that's valid, and it returns a session cookie that the browser can then pass with every future request to go and get data or submit data back to the server. And then we're going to use other API calls to get data, and we're going to update data, and we also are able to delete data as well. And each time we do any of those operations, that session cookie is going to get passed with the request. So this screenshot on the right-hand side of the page here is an AJAX post that logs the user into LDC Via. within the React framework, and then once it's got a valid login, it then rebuilds the rest of the page to say that the user is logged in, and we can now redraw real data as opposed to a login screen. The key thing to note here is the property XHR fields when we're doing the AJAX request. By default, when you're doing an AJAX request, you're not normally allowed to pass cookies across. It's a security restriction. We have enabled on the LDC Via server support for cross-domain cookie passing, and for you to take advantage of that, you use this XHR fields property and set the with credentials property to true. What that means is that every request then will pass any cookies that we have for the LDC Via domain across to LDC Via when we make a request to it. So in this example here, we're going to ldcvia.com, and then we're calling the login API function, and we're passing to it a username, an email address and a password. And then if we get a successful response, we set a React property to called logged in to true. And if we get a failure, then we set the logged in property to false, and we re-render the login page with an error message. So rather than me just talking around the code, let's go and just see it working. So this is the login screen, and you can see it's rendered with Bootstrap. I've already entered my username and password, so I'm just going to click login. And that's now going and talking to the LDC Via server. It sent back a cookie and has said, yep, you've logged in correctly. So it's given me a session cookie, and then I've gone off and requested to go and get a list of people from the database. I can also go and add someone. So if I do a person called test and post them, that will do a submit back to the LDC Via server, and that will automatically refresh into the list of people here, and I'm able to edit that person if I want to, post that back. And it's very basic create, read, update, delete style functionality. In terms of the code, we've already looked briefly at this login submit. So this is the React call to go and actually do that post operation to the LDC Via server. What happens when we've set the logged in property to true is that we then go and rebuild the screen, and we call this function called load people from server. And in this case, when we load the list of people from the server, we're actually just doing an AJAX GET request. We pass in the host name of the server. We call the collections API, which is documented on the API website for LDC Via, the name of the database that we're working against, and we've got a collection called person. So the type of data that we're getting back is called a person. We don't want to cache the data. We want to pass our session cookie. And then finally, once we've got some data, we use this set state method. Set state basically says, right, reinitialize all of the output of the HTML for this page, and we can go and then render the list of people that are returned to us. And this is where we output. So this function here called render is where we go and get the list of each individual person. We output a list item, and we output the this is the read mode version of it. We output the first name and the last name, and then we have edit and delete buttons that get displayed depending on the situation at the time. So the code itself is really simple. The demo that we showed you there was just a couple of hundred lines of JavaScript, and most of that really is HTML to show in different situations. But the point here really is that we're just using a REST API. It doesn't really matter what the REST API is. In this case, it's LDC Via, and it's very, very simple to get to use in your client-side application development. So you can go and have a look at this source code. We've published a public GitHub project on the LDC Via GitHub page, and you can also go and actually see that demo that I was just showing you. It's this URL here will take you through to that page, and you can go and see what's actually happening, trace through the AJAX requests, and see what happens when you stick in an incorrect username or password and all that sort of thing. So that's a very, very simple demo, and I'm now going to hand on to Mark, who is going to talk about a different approach to how to work with the API.
So I'm going to be showing you a Java framework and the use of LDC Via in a more traditional framework rather than the common JavaScript, and I'm going to use Vaadin. Vaadin is a Java web application framework. It's server-side and client-side, so you get the best of both worlds. It's built on top of GWT for the client side. It can be deployed as both server and portlets. And in my opinion, it's one of the simplest ways to write a really good web UI with Java. You can get it working on Domino. If Domino is your thing and you want to do a slow transition, it works brilliantly on just about every Java server. Works very fast, very efficiently. It's very, very easy to build a pleasant screen. So let's just have a look at a screen. This is obviously a very limited screen, but we just want to create a username, password, and have two fields to put something in and a button. So if we go and have a look at Eclipse, you can actually see that we're just initializing, and we're just going to have a vertical layout. And that's very much what you'd expect. When you add something, it puts it underneath. Keep adding things, it keeps putting them underneath each other. We're just going to call that layout. We're just going to set some basic margins, and we're going to say the content of the output is going to be this layout. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to create a horizontal layout, which we're going to call rows. It's easier to think of them in terms of rows than in layouts. What they really are underneath all the covers are just divs. And one of the nice things you can do with Vaadin is to just say, okay, I don't want you to do any layouts, just create the divs for me and I'll handle them with my style sheet. So you can take existing corporate style sheets and then just apply them to these divs. But in this case, we're going to use a lot of the built-in automated stuff for Vaadin because it makes it simpler. We're going to create a text field. It's all very, very simple. Give it a name, give it a default value, and then we're going to add that text field to that row. We're going to repeat the same with the password, give it a default value, and add that to the row. And you can see how that'll be. So we've just added them to two horizontal items in a horizontal layout. We're going to add that row to the main layout, so that'll mean it'll be stored, and then repeat ourselves. So here's our text field for the URL, and there's our text field for the default database. This is slightly naughty. I shouldn't do it here, but I just did it for simplicity. You should really do this with style sheets, but you can do it in fixed ways with Vaadin. Add that row to the layout. Next, we're going to create a table. Again, it's not meant to in any way, shape, or form. We're going to hide it because initially it's not populated. We don't want to show anything because it's just an empty table. And that, which I will get to in a second, will actually contain all of the records that we're going to fetch from Via. And then at the bottom of it all, we're going to put a button. And that button has a click listener, and we can just put the code for what happens in the click straight after that. And then we're going to add both the button and the table to the layout. That gives us that. So if I just show you what it does, so we've got the username and password, and if I type in a password, it scuttles off to LDC Via and fetches all the data. Let's have a look at what actually happens there. So when you click box, it just calls a function I've written called login in this class. Let's go and have a look at it. It passes it the URL value, the username value, and the password value. Here it is. Here's our three values. We're just going to create a post URL, which is basically just going to create a URL just with the bits of text, and then we're going to post that, just fire it up with using the most basic of HTML calls. It should be noted here that I'm doing it in the most basic fashion possible. There are thousands and thousands of ways of handling REST data with Java, Jersey, RESTlet being my personal favorite. But I wanted to show you how simple it is to do it without any extra bells and whistles. So that just sends the stuff off to Via, and we get a response. We're going to test just to see that it was okay. It was okay, so we're going to get the REST response as a string and send it back. Here it is, the body of it. Now, at the moment, it's just in a big long string, just as most JSON data is. I don't like working like that in Java, so we're going to convert it into a nice class. Now, we actually know the class that it's going to come back as, but we need to create it. It's boring to type all of this in yourself. So what you can actually do is there's lovely websites, and one of my favorites is called JSON Schema to Pojo. And if you go to that and paste in your JSON data, it will build you a Java class to match it, which is very, very useful. So we've taken the JSON data, we've pasted that, we've got our class. Now we want a little tool to actually map the JSON data straight to our Java class. And personally, you can't do better than JSON for that. It's a free library from Google, and it has a nice simple function from JSON. Give it the text, give it the class that you want it to map to, and it will do that all for you. So all we've done there is we've passed it the username and password. It has returned the API key, and the API key is very useful in that you don't have to use username and password all the time. So you can set it up, get your API key, store that in a config document, and it's not the big security issue that leaving a password around is. We then take that API key, return that as a string. If we pop back to our UI, we can see that we've got the API. Now, with that API, we can go and get a list of people. Got another little function, pass it URL, the people database name, and our security API. Let's just have a quick check of that. Very much simple. This one's even simpler. It's just a get. We go to the collections, put base URL, the database name, and we send the API key. That will just return another big chunk of string, which will just be the JSON data. Repeat what we did before with JSON. We've got a people class that we just auto-generated, shove the data in it, tell it which class we want it to. It will regurgitate a big pile of people, which we can then, with Vaadin, just loop through. So with all the people we've got returned, just loop through them and add items to tables. When we do that, it's a simple call. It will pass all the things down, and it will just building up a simple table. That just shows how easy it is to use loosely typed data, stuff like LDC Via in Java, where you're more used to it being tightly typed. It's very easy. I've done it in the most simple way possible. Have a look through the different JSON handling libraries that are available at Java, particularly Jersey and Restless, I would recommend, and see which one works best for you. A lot of them they're very much of a muchness feature-wise, but a lot of them require different ways of thinking, so pick the one that works best with you. The only way to do that is to try setting one up. If you reach one and think, oh, this is taking for ages, no, pick a different library. But this shows you how easy it is to take modern REST data and use it with the traditional Java or Scala or whichever one of your Java stacks you prefer. I think now we're going to pass over to Ben, who's going to show you an alternative JavaScript framework. Ben, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Mark. Righty-ho, so I'm going to be talking about Node.js as it's known, and talking about it in tandem with something called Express, which I will get to in just a second. Node.js has been around for about 6 or 7 years. It's an application runtime, so it's something that's running on the server rather than client side, and it's rightly got a very good reputation for being particularly scalable and performant. And this is really all down to the core technology at use in Node. So it's built around Google's V8 JavaScript engine, which in turn is using a very simple event loop and a very, very low level, i.e. fast, I/O layer. So it can really kind of hammer through events, and the whole architecture within Node is built around that. The product itself is sponsored by Joyent, who are quite a large outfit, and like I said, Node's been around for about 7 years, and it's also cross-platform. You can deploy it to Linux. You can deploy it on Mac OS, and since 2011, when Microsoft joined the initiative, you can also deploy to Windows. Around about 2011, the Node package manager was also introduced, known as NPM, and that really helps drive forward with projects in that it manages all the dependencies for you. There are oodles of frameworks and projects out there that can be drawn in as dependencies to your Node project. Probably worth mentioning that LDC Via itself is a Node application. People familiar with what we're doing with LDC Via know, or probably know, that we build a lot of it on top of MongoDB, the venerable document data store. But the core engine is all built around Node. And Node is what I'm going to be talking about and showing you in a few moments. Now, I mentioned Express earlier. Express is a web application framework, pretty much a de facto standard. Again, it's been around for quite a while. It's nicely architected, it's straightforward to understand, and it's readily extensible. And indeed, IBM recently bequeathed Express to the Node.js Foundation, so it really does sit alongside Node pretty much every way. There are other web application frameworks out there. There's Socket.io, Koa, Sails, Drywall, and many others. But Sails and Drywall, for example, or certainly Drywall, are actually built on top of Express. So it really is that important to the Node ecosystem. So I said it's a web application framework. It sits on the server side on Node, obviously. And what that really means is that it handles things like application routing, plenty of HTTP utilities, middleware, and when we talk about middleware, we're talking about connectivity, particularly database connectivity and things like that, and an API all of its own. It can also handle things like request body and cookie parsing, and importantly, session management. Now, the routing capabilities, so how you're actually handling all those different web addresses in your application, are very similar to those found in Sinatra, which is an extremely popular web application framework for Ruby, and it was the inspiration for Express. Rather like Sinatra and other frameworks on other platforms, Express also offers what's known as scaffolding. And there's just an example on that slide now, just a simple command line which will generate a file directory structure for a new application called Hello World App, and it will create all the basic placeholder files that you would need. So the entry point application file, things like directories to handle assets, like things like style sheets and JavaScript, and so on and so forth. So that's just a 50,000 foot view of Express. what I'm using here, because this is all on the server, we need something to render a user interface. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into that because we're really looking to talk about how we're making use of the LDC Via API. But it's probably just worth mentioning that we're using Jade, which is one of the standard view engines for Express, although of course you can use any user interface really that you want. Jade is just a very straightforward templating language, and you can see on the screen right now it's a fairly straightforward pseudo HTML kind of construct. And here this example snippet of code is taken from the demo application that I'm going to show in just 1 second. And this is a snippet that is displaying a person from the people directory that Matt showed earlier. This snippet is simply displaying a person. So there's a form. You can see there's some curly brace placeholders, and they are actually picking up attributes that are pushed into the view by our web application. And we're pulling out things like a full name field. And in this example at the bottom, you can see we're also pulling out the first name field. Now, there's more content. This is just a snippet. But the entities that you can see on the screen, such as form, h2, div, label, input, they're all straightforward and they result in HTML as you would expect. So the key thing here is that we're pushing an attribute into the view called entry, and we're using a fairly familiar dot notation to pull out attributes from that. Now, how does this entry attribute make it to our view, and how do we make use of it? This is where it comes to actually making use of the LDC Via API. And here what I'm showing you is an extract from the demo application, and specifically there's a JavaScript file in there where we lay out all of our routes, our application routes, so how we deal with different web addresses and so on and so forth. Now here we have a router object already created, and this particular example is dealing with a GET request, and it's a GET request where we've said, well, I want an entry, and here's a unique ID for that entry. So that colon unit entry that you can see on your screen at the moment, that is effectively a variable, and saying that, you know, in place of that we will actually pick up the unit that's being passed in. We're then saying with this GET request that we're going to invoke a GET on the LDC Via API. And as you can see, we're pulling out things like an API host from a config object, and we're constructing a URL. Now, in Mark and Matt's examples, we talked about collections of documents. What we're talking about in this example is pulling out from the document API. So in this instance, we're actually saying we will go to the LDC Via API host, i.e. the server name. We're going to be using the document API, hence the /document section here. We're passing in the database that we actually want to use, again from a config. And then we're passing in the string person. Now what we're referring to here is the collection. So our collection of similar documents is called person. And finally, we're pulling the unit out of the attribute that's being passed in on the GET request, so we know which person document we actually want to see. Upon successful completion of that GET request, we're then just saying let's render a response. So this is vanilla Express here. We're going to push it into entry read, and we're pushing in effectively a JSON payload which reflects the data that we've got back from the API in loading up that document. Now what I'll do is I'll just switch to the application itself. So very similar to Matt's example, similar bootstrap styling, but this is an application that's running on the server. So we're just going to log in. And you'll see that we have a collection of people here, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that we test edited is there, which was the entry that Matt added in his example. So it's just to show that we're actually working against the same data source, albeit from different applications. So here's test edited. I'm just going to change that and submit and edit. So it's really just to show that this application, and as you can see the ED's gone, this application is performing the same kind of operations that Matt's example was working on. And that when we open a document, what we're actually doing is we're calling that LDC Via API, and we're performing a get on a given document. And the API is returning stuff to us. And thanks to our Jade template that knows we have an entry attribute with first name and last name fields and so on and so forth, we can then render it in the user interface. So that's just covering that example there. Incidentally, if we just, I'll just switch back to the example code. We're using a thing here called, we're using a thing here called Wrestler. And Wrestler is one of those NPM dependencies I was talking about earlier. It's a library that just makes doing HTTP operations just a little bit simpler within Express. So that's just an aside to mention what that is. So you can see that we've been calling the LDC Via API. You saw that rendering an individual, and this is kind of what the payload looks like. So the user I brought up earlier was Fred Blogs, and this is the payload, or at least some of it. It's a standard JSON payload. We have an ID field, a first name field, a last name field. We do have a full name field as well, which just concatenates those two. And there are more attributes. This person directory actually came from a migration from a Domino application, so there's all things like address data, city, and so on and so forth. So there are more attributes in the payload, but it's just to give you an idea of what we're actually pulling in. So that really covers the demonstration of the node, i.e. server-side application. One thing I just wanted to highlight is that I've been making some changes. I changed test edited to test edit. And you may notice that I've also got Matt's React demo open in another tab here, although I haven't switched to it and done anything. But if I just switch to that, you'll see that my change to test edited to become test edit is already reflected in Matt's user interface, and that is just an aside. That's a nice aspect of the React.js framework in that it's dynamically updating. So if I change Fred Blogs, for example, let's just add some digits to his name and submit that edit. If I switch back to, you can see the changes here in mine. If I switch to the React demo, you see that that change is already reflected in Matt's user interface. So it's just a nice thing to highlight within that particular example. So that, in conclusion, that just kind of brings us to an end of the node portion of this demo. And I will hand back to my colleague Julian, and we will wrap up the session for you. Thank you for your time.
So, hello. Thank you, Matt, Mark, Ben. I hope you've found their contributions useful, and you've got a little bit of an idea of some of the power of the API. If that's raised questions that you've not already typed into the webinar chat question and answer area, then this might be a good moment to do that while I summarize. So we've talked about how LDC Via lets you move data from Domino into this secure, scalable, and very accessible platform without losing some of the key Domino data features like readers and authors fields and response hierarchies and things, and without having to remodel and restructure and clean, and otherwise compromise and modify the data when it's moving from one place to another. It's worth pointing out also that you don't have to start with migrated Domino data. You could just create a blank LDC Via database and build completely new applications. That is a very supported standard use case. It's just that we're focusing at the moment on the migration from Domino in the context of this webinar. And we've looked at how modern JavaScript libraries such as React, client-side JavaScript libraries, can easily work with using LDC Via as a back-end data store and back-end database. And similarly, how server-side frameworks such as Node and Vaadin, which we saw, can work equally well and equally easily with LDC Via. Excuse me. And we've looked at some parts of the API, but there is a lot more to discover, and it's at api.ldcvia.com. There's a lot of documentation there. Could we move on to the next slide? Ah, lovely. Thank you. My favorite is the searching API. By the way, that's my personal favorite. If you've come from a Domino background where you're used to a big separation between field-based, select-based searching and full-text searching, in the LDC Via API, we bring those two together into a single search mechanism. So that's really powerful. And we've talked a little bit about how security is managed, particularly with the two different mechanisms for authentication. There's actually a lot more about some of these aspects of LDC Via, about the data integrity, about the security in the previous webinar, which I've mentioned before, and you can get to from the website or on YouTube. Yes, but so let's address some of the, before we address the specific questions that have come in on the chat, let's address some of the most common ones that we get asked. So we're migrating to Office 365 and SharePoint. And what? Well, this is a very common one. And if you are migrating applications to SharePoint, and that's the strategic decision you've taken, there are two main bits of technical work involved in moving your Domino applications. The first is migrating the data, and the second is building the new application. We believe LDC Via still has a massive role to play here, because as we've discussed, it allows the data to be migrated into this sort of scalable and accessible platform with very little investment of time and resources. And that's time both in a calendar sense, in the way that it can be migrated quickly, and also in the sort of consulting hours or person day type sense. So I've seen anecdotal evidence, and I would class it as anecdotal from my perspective, so don't quote me as though this is chapter and verse, that it takes somewhere between a third and a half of a Domino to SharePoint migration project just to migrate the data. And that's because it's a classic square peg into a round hole situation, and there's an awful lot of work to do to restructure and remodel the data in order to be able to fit it into SharePoint. So LDC Via is potentially a huge time saver there, an effort saver, and lets you concentrate resources on the stuff that brings the business benefit, which is the applications. There's actually less business benefit in moving the data that's not going to affect the users directly. Also worth pointing out that the next major release of LDC Via, and this is another coming soon feature, will be including SAML support for identity management, and that will mean that LDC Via will fit really well into a SharePoint environment in terms of being able to be used as an integrated data store within SharePoint. So that's that first question. The second question, we don't know where to start. Well, this is another common problem. As I said earlier, organizations have many, many databases. And if you know that you need to do something to get moving, but you don't know where to start, then we can certainly help. Analyzing the stock of applications for usage patterns and data volumes and complexity is a great first step to finding a route through that impenetrable jungle of what to do now. So if that's of interest, then contact us separately. We're not going to talk any more about that now, but certainly we can help there. Next question, that we don't want to get locked in. Well, that's fair enough. And there are several ways we can kind of mitigate that fear. The first and obvious way is if you want to have this system on premises rather than in the cloud, as we've been looking at in this webinar, then we can supply that. We talk about the cloud because it's easier, but we do have an on-premises offering too. Part of the reason that we believe why people have felt locked into Domino, well, there are two parts really. Firstly, the Notes and Domino platform is tied very closely to these client tools like Lotus Notes and Domino Designer. So it doesn't have this open and accessible feel that is the modern way or the 21st century way. And that creates an impression of being locked in and the reality of being locked in too. And secondly, the ability to export data from Notes hasn't really kept up with the times, to put it mildly. So it's quite fiddly to get data out of Notes and Domino sometimes. Now, with LDC Via, not only do we have these amazing APIs, but we also have that we haven't shown a generic data browsing tool, and that is covered in the previous webinar that I've mentioned plenty of times. And that has the ability to export data to spreadsheet and to PDF and all sorts of things. Why can't we just move the data directly to X platform, whatever X is? Well, you can, of course, but we believe it will probably be more painful and more time-consuming and slower and more expensive than moving it to LDC Via. Now, depending on your character, you might like things that are painful, time-consuming, and expensive, in which case, fill your boots. But our assertion would be that you're better off spending your budget and time where it really counts, which is delivering useful applications and functionality that will benefit the business and benefit the users and move forward. So if we now have any questions in the question box, we've got, I can see one from Steve. What documentation is there? Matt, do you want to give us a guided tour?
I can indeed. Let me go to a browser window. So this is, as much as anything, this is for our benefit, because when we, oops, I'll just fit that window. When we're writing all of the public-facing applications that we do with LDC Via, we use our own API. So we don't really have any hidden backdoors to go and get at data. So if we need an API call, then we have to go off and write it, and we then publish it to everyone else. So we publish all of our API details here. So things that we've looked at today are things like logging in. You've got examples of how to send data, how to get it back using jQuery. We've got data or details on how to go and get data from collections, how to get data from documents. And then we've got other things, so working with file attachments, working with access control to grant individual users access to databases and to groups within databases. And then we've got utility functions. So Julia mentioned things like exporting to PDF, exporting to Excel. You can do also export to EML format from mail databases, for example. So there are a lot of API calls, and this site is designed to try and make it as easy as possible for you to get started working with the API And there are also, of course, the samples that you can download from our GitHub page, which support multiple different languages, so JavaScript, Java, .NET, XPages, all sorts of different little samples that show you how to get going with the basics of working with the API.
Thank you, Matt. Ben, are there any more questions to be answered?
Sorry, I'm just taking a look now. Oh, actually, one of the questions was quite timely because that was about demo code. So again, we have a public, or we have a number of public GitHub repositories. The demo code that we've seen today is either there or is going to be uploaded shortly. And as Matt said, we have a number of other pieces of code, for example, stuff that you can do in .NET or XPages or with Angular. They're all available up on our public GitHub repository, which will be linked from our developers page. And we had one other question, actually more concerning the data migration, which was whether we can do the data migration for customers. And the answer is yes. We perform on-site services work. We do have some services bundles. So rather than kind of time and materials based work, we offer bundles of work and consultancy to actually get you up and running with Via in a way that makes sense for you and your organization. And we also have a forthcoming tool for uploading single instances of Domino databases in a very sort of straightforward manner. I'm conscious we're a little over time. I don't know whether we want to mention any more about the uploading tool at this stage, but if anyone's interested in that, by all means, get in touch.
Thank you very much. So I think we will shortly draw it to a close. We'd love to hear your feedback on the webinar. So if you'd be happy for me to give you a ring, won't be a pushy sales call, just a chat and some feedback. Please stick your phone number in the chat box or email us on info@ldcvia.com or phone us or contact us on Twitter or Facebook. There is no end of options. And if there's a particular day or time that would be most convenient, then let us know. And an offer, there's always an offer on a webinar. So if you sign up for a paid account at the website and use the coupon code April16, you get 3 months access free at the paid level that you've signed up for. So we do have a free level which is fully functional, but it's very limited on the amount of data and the number of databases you can use. If you want to sign up for a higher level that would normally be paid and get 3 months free and really put the thing through its paces, then that's a great opportunity and a great offer. So we believe that it's now a great time to be moving some or even all of your data off Domino. The technology stack we've used for LDC Via is powerful. It's widely used. It's very widely accepted. And frankly, it's a testament to the foresight of the original creators of Notes and Domino that this is really the first time that there's been a great, compelling answer to that question of what next after Domino. And with that, I think we are done. Thank you for attending the webinar today. Thank you for watching this webinar. If you're watching it on YouTube or wherever it's uploaded to, and do go and use that offer code. If you're watching the webinar on YouTube in 2025, then possibly that code may have expired by this point, but you know, give it a go. And yeah, thank you, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.